History tells us that light was born from one man's genius. That a single inventor, Thomas Alva Edison, banished the darkness and lit the modern world. But history is written by those who hold the patents. And the light we worship was not pure. The truth flickers, if you dare to look closely. Behind the glowing bulb, behind every filament of tungsten and every story of triumph, lies a trail of stolen ideas, broken lives, and the quiet burial of countless minds who reached for the same light, but were crushed by its shadow. The light bulb was not merely an invention. It was a battlefield, a war fought not with weapons, but with lawsuits, manipulation, and greed. A war that decided who would be remembered as the bringer of light, and who would vanish into history's darkness. We are told Edison created light. But the deeper truth is that light was created by many, and then taken by one. In the final decades of the 19th century, humanity stood at the threshold of illumination. Factories roared through the night, cities expanded, and electricity became the new bloodstream of civilization. But the age of light was not born from a single spark, it was stolen, refined, and sold as perfection. For every glowing filament, there was a man left in ruin. For every shining patent, a forgotten dreamer burned out. The story of the light bulb is not a story of progress. It is a story of power. It is not the triumph of invention, but the triumph of control, the transformation of light into currency, and curiosity into empire. And perhaps the most haunting paradox of all. In humanity's quest to conquer the darkness, it was light itself that blinded us. For more than a century, the story has been told in classrooms, textbooks, and corporate museums like scripture. The story of a lone genius who refused to give up, a man in a dusty workshop in Menlo Park, who through countless sleepless nights, turned fragile glass and glowing wire into the first enduring light bulb. They call him the Wizard of Menlo Park. A man who transformed the night into day. A self-made inventor who, through persistence and brilliance, gave humanity the gift of eternal light. Children grew up learning his name before they could spell electricity. His portrait, often shown with the warm halo of a filament behind him, became the modern saint of innovation. He was the proof that genius could rise from humble beginnings, that dreams could ignite revolutions, that one man could quite literally light up the world. But every myth is built to serve someone. And this one was no different. In the late 1800s, America was changing. The age of industry demanded new idols, men who could embody the spirit of capitalism, progress, and divine destiny. Edison was perfect for the part. He had the charisma of a showman and the hunger of an empire builder. Reporters adored him. Investors trusted him. The world needed a symbol, and he needed a throne. When Edison's light bulb flickered to life in December 1879, it wasn't just a technical demonstration, it was a coronation. The newspapers declared that the darkness of ages has been dispelled. The crowd gasped as filaments glowed softly through the glass, like captured stars. The moment seemed divine. And so, the myth was sealed. Edison, the benevolent genius who invented the light bulb, who gave humankind its second sunrise. It was a story too beautiful to question, too profitable to challenge, too luminous to see through. But beneath that glow, something else was happening. Patents were being bought up, competitors erased, and credit rewritten. And somewhere, in a quiet room in Ohio, in a modest workshop in England, and in the dim corners of European laboratories, other inventors watched the headlines, realizing that the light they had created, now bore another man's name. The world was told that Edison invented the light bulb. But the truth was far more fractured, a mosaic of forgotten sparks, stolen flames, and extinguished lives. Because the story we were given was not history. It was marketing. Every myth begins to tremble when truth starts whispering through the cracks. And for the myth of Edison's light bulb, those whispers began almost immediately, faint at first, like the buzz of a weak current in an old filament. But they grew louder with time, echoing across continents and through the archives of forgotten men. In the shadows of this grand invention stood another name, Sir Joseph Swan, an English physicist and chemist who, years before Edison's public triumph, had already coaxed light from a filament enclosed in a glass bulb. In 1878, nearly a year before Edison's dramatic demonstration, Swan had unveiled his version before the Newcastle Chemical Society. His bulb glowed, quietly and steadily. Newspapers in Britain called it a wonder of the modern age. But Swan's name would fade, while Edison's would be immortalized. Why? Because Edison didn't just invent, he conquered. Swan's invention had limitations. It used a carbonized paper filament that burned out quickly. Edison's team, with greater resources and relentless experimentation, refined it into a longer-lasting carbon filament. But the foundation, the very concept of a bulb sealed in a vacuum to prevent oxygen from destroying the filament, was already there. Swan had built the bridge. Edison simply walked across it and claimed the land. And Swan was not alone. There was Heinrich Goebel, a German-born mechanic living in New York, who claimed to have built a working incandescent lamp as early as the 1850s, using a carbonized bamboo filament inside a vacuum tube. Goebel had no marketing machine, no laboratories, no lawyers. His invention flickered in obscurity until, decades later, he found himself dragged into Edison's lawsuits as a weapon against Edison himself. When Goebel testified, his story was dismissed. Too old, too unpolished, too unbelievable. He died in poverty, his truth buried beneath the glow of Edison's myth. The cracks widened. Historians and engineers began to find old patents, from Frederick de Moulins in 1841, Warren de la Rue in 1840, and Alexander Lodogin in 1874, each describing a version of the incandescent light. Each one a spark that burned too early, in a world not yet ready to see it. And yet, when the public looked to the light bulb, they saw only Edison's face reflected in the glass. Because invention, in the Gilded Age, was not about who first discovered an idea, it was about who could afford to own it. The truth was not measured in brilliance, but in patents, publicity, and power. It was a time when the light of innovation was chained to the machinery of profit, and the hands that built it were rarely the hands that kept it. In a world blinded by spectacle, the first victims of light were the men who created it. Before Edison's laboratories became cathedrals of invention, before the world began to worship the incandescent glow as the dawn of a new age, there were quiet, solitary figures, men who dreamed of light not for profit, but for wonder. They lived on the margins of empire, their names scattered like ashes through forgotten patents and yellowed newspaper clippings. Among them stood Humphrey Davy, the first to coax electricity into brilliance. In 1802, in a modest London laboratory, he connected wires to a platinum strip and watched it burn with a blinding white glow, the first electric light in human history. It was not yet practical, not yet contained. But in that brief flare, Davy glimpsed a vision of what the world could become: nights conquered, streets illuminated, knowledge unbound. Davy's students would continue his work, among them Michael Faraday, who would later unlock the principles of electromagnetic induction, the foundation upon which all electrical power rests. These men sought illumination not as conquest, but as communion, a meeting between science and soul. They were philosophers of light. But philosophy has no shareholders. By the mid-19th century, as industry accelerated, light ceased to be a metaphor. It became a market. And in that transition, the dreamers began to vanish. Warren de la Rue, a British scientist of exquisite precision, had built a light bulb decades before Edison, using coiled platinum filaments in a vacuum tube. His design worked, but platinum was too expensive for mass production. His brilliance was defeated not by ignorance, but by economics. He died with his discovery intact and uncelebrated it. Alexander Lodogin, a Russian engineer, produced an incandescent lamp using a carbon rod as a filament. In 1874, he patented his design, 5 years before Edison's first bulb. The Russian public marveled at his invention, but he lacked investors, and soon his company collapsed. He emigrated, disillusioned, another prophet cast into darkness. And then there was Joseph Swan, the Englishman who had quietly beaten Edison to the finish line. His early bulbs illuminated homes in Newcastle before Edison's laboratories even completed their first prototype. But Swan was too modest, too patient, too principled to fight in the brutal theater of American capitalism. When Edison's legal machinery came for him, he compromised. They formed a joint company in Britain, Eddie Swan, a name that swallowed Swan's identity whole. His contribution was absorbed, his name nearly erased. Each of these men held a piece of the same celestial puzzle. Each was devoured by a system that valued patents over people, spectacle over truth. They wanted to bring light to humanity. Edison wanted to bring light to market. And that was the difference. For every forgotten architect, there was a price, a life dimmed, a legacy rewritten. The light bulb was never one man's miracle. It was a mosaic of sacrifice, 1,000 small flames extinguished so that one could burn brighter than all the rest. Their light did not fail. It was taken. By the 1880s, the light bulb had become more than an invention, it was the key to empire. And Thomas Edison, the so-called wizard, was less a scientist than a general in a war for electrical dominion. His laboratory at Menlo Park had grown into a fortress of patents, lawyers, and propaganda. Every wire, every socket, every flicker of illumination became territory to be claimed, fenced, and sold. To control the light was to control the future. Edison understood something the pure inventors never did, that invention meant nothing without monopoly. He once said, "The value of an idea lies in the using of it." But what he truly meant was, in the owning of it. The machinery of power began to turn. Edison's company, Edison Electric Light Company, backed by Wall Street titans like J.P. Morgan, started purchasing rival patents, silencing competitors, and rewriting the narrative of discovery. Men like Swan, Lodygen, and Goebel were not simply out-invented, they were out-financed, outmaneuvered, and buried under paperwork. Patents became weapons. Courtrooms became battlefields. And innovation became war. One by one, inventors fell, not for lack of genius, but because they lacked the capital to defend it. The U.S. Patent Office was flooded with claims, but Edison's team always seemed to emerge victorious, backed by an army of lawyers and publicists who shaped the myth of his singular brilliance. In 1883, Edison filed a patent infringement suit against Swan in Britain, the very man whose work had preceded his own. The irony was staggering, but power cares little for irony. The two men settled, merging into the Eddie Swan Company. History would remember one name. Guess which one? As the light bulb empire grew, Edison's laboratories expanded into corporate temples, filled not with thinkers, but with laborers. Dozens of anonymous engineers toiled through the night, developing what Edison's name alone would later receive credit for. It was innovation industrialized, the assembly line of genius. Edison became the face of collective brilliance, privatized and branded under one name. But the machinery of power demanded more than ownership, it demanded annihilation of rivals. When George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla emerged with their alternating current, AC, system, a more efficient and far-reaching form of electrical power, Edison saw not progress, but rebellion. He launched a ruthless campaign to destroy them, staging public electrocutions of animals, spreading fear that AC was lethal, and even helping design the first electric chair to associate his rival's current with death itself. The man who had been hailed as the bringer of light was now weaponizing electricity to preserve his empire. The light bulb, once a symbol of human enlightenment, had become an emblem of human greed. The machinery of power was complete, an invention turned industry, an industry turned monopoly, and a man turned myth. And as that machinery roared, it consumed not only competitors but ideals. Because the real invention of the light bulb was not light. It was control. By the end of the 1880s, the world was glowing. From the gas-lit streets of London to the electric boulevards of New York, humanity's nights were no longer dark. The sky itself seemed conquered, tamed into submission by filaments and fire. But behind this radiance, something irreversible had happened. The light bulb had ceased to be an idea. It had become a weapon, a symbol of domination wielded by corporations that claimed to bring progress while quietly strangling its creators. At the center of this transformation stood Edison Electric, a name that now towered above the industry like a god. Yet even gods fall prey to greater empires. The same financiers who had built Edison's throne would soon dismantle it, not because of moral revelation, but because profit demanded it. In 1889, J.P. Morgan and other investors forced Edison out of control of his own company. They merged his enterprise with Thomson Houston Electric to form a new entity, General Electric. The Wizard of Menlo Park, once the master of light, had been outshone by the machine he created. The myth remained, but the man was quietly sidelined. The inventor who had claimed ownership over every rival's work was now a relic of his own making, replaced by the faceless machinery of corporate power. But the true breaking point, the moment when light itself was enslaved, came not in a laboratory or courtroom, but in the invisible transformation of an idea into a system. For the first time in history, electricity became centralized, regulated, and sold as a utility. It was no longer an open field of experimentation, it was a grid, a network, a leash. What began as human curiosity, the search to understand light, had ended as human submission to those who owned it. The filaments that once symbolized discovery now represented dependence. To illuminate one's home required permission, payment, compliance. The glowing bulb, hanging innocently from every ceiling, was the silent signature of a vast and unseen empire. And so, the age of light, the age of progress, was born in the same moment that freedom of invention died. Edison's legend burned brighter than ever, but it was an artificial light, crafted to obscure what it had destroyed. The forgotten architects, Davy, De La Rue, Lautigen, Swan, Goebel, were already shadows, their legacies fading in the glare of Edison's spotlight. The darkness had not been banished. It had only changed its form. It now lived within the very light itself, in its monopolies, its exploitation, its quiet rewriting of truth. For centuries, humanity had feared the dark. Now, for the first time, it feared the light. When the last candle was extinguished and the hum of electricity became the heartbeat of modern life, few paused to ask what had been lost in the glow. The world embraced the light bulb as a triumph of civilization, proof that mankind had finally subdued nature and banished its ancient enemy, the night. Cities no longer slept. Factories no longer rested. Humanity could now produce, consume, and conquer around the clock. But progress has a price, and the bill was written in invisible ink. The very light that promised liberation became a quiet form of servitude. The night, once sacred, mysterious, a time for reflection and rest, was mechanized. The rhythm of the human body was broken, its centuries-old dance with darkness replaced by the ceaseless pulse of industry. Workers toiled beneath electric lamps that never dimmed, their exhaustion masked by artificial day. The light bulb had not simply illuminated the world, it had colonized time itself. In homes, the glow became a symbol of comfort and prosperity, yet few realized that its uniform light was also a form of conformity. Before electricity, every flame carried personality, flickering, breathing, alive. The new light was sterile, obedient, eternal. The human relationship with light, once intimate and spiritual, had been industrialized. Even art changed. Painters no longer wrestled with shadows as their ancestors had. Writers no longer described the night as infinite. Under electric light, mystery shrank. Certainty grew. The world, once veiled in chiaroscuro, became flat and exposed. And in that exposure, the soul of invention dimmed. Where once discovery had been a poetic act, the joining of curiosity and courage, it now became a transaction. Laboratories turned into corporations. Curiosity became property. Meanwhile, the myth of Edison hardened into gospel. Children recited his name as the father of light, never learning of the nameless inventors who had burned out in his shadow. Textbooks declared the incandescent bulb as Edison's creation, and even when historians uncovered the deeper truth, the world shrugged. The myth was more comforting than the reality. After all, who wants to believe that light, the symbol of purity and truth, was born from theft and deception. And so the lie endured, woven into the very fabric of modernity. Every time a switch was flipped, every time a room filled with electric light, humanity unknowingly honored not invention, but empire. The light bulb had transformed civilization, that much was true. But it had also transformed morality. It taught us that truth was negotiable, that memory could be purchased, and that the brightest glow could conceal the deepest shadow. Because when the light came on, it didn't just reveal the world. It blinded it. More than a century has passed since Edison's bulb first illuminated the darkness, and yet its shadow still stretches across our world. Every modern invention, every screen, every device, every gleaming marvel of technology, carries within it the same paradox that the light bulb first revealed, the illusion of progress built upon the burial of its makers. We like to believe we live in an enlightened age, one defined by transparency, truth, and innovation. But look closely, and you will see that we have not escaped the old machinery of power. We have only digitized it. The corporations that once sold light now sell attention. The filaments have become pixels. The patents have become algorithms. And just as in Edison's time, the narrative of the lone genius, the myth of the visionary savior, remains our favorite illusion. When we speak of modern inventors, Jobs, Musk, Zuckerberg, we repeat the same ritual of worship once reserved for Edison. We elevate one man and erase the collective. We forget the teams of nameless engineers, coders, and thinkers who make the machine possible. We ignore the failures, the thefts, the quiet injustices buried under the glow of corporate storytelling. The machinery of power still hums, silent and invisible, beneath the surface of every miracle. Innovation, we are told, is freedom. But in truth, innovation has become enclosure, the capturing of what was once shared, the privatization of what was once open. Edison's empire was built on electricity. Ours is built on data. But the principle is identical: control the current, and you control the world. The same moral blindness persists. When Edison electrocuted animals to discredit Tesla's current, it was called science. When modern tech companies harvest private lives to feed their algorithms, it is called innovation. In both cases, power disguises exploitation as progress. Even our relationship to light itself has changed again. We live now in a world that never sleeps, a digital night filled with artificial suns. The human eye, once guided by the cycle of dawn and dusk, is now trapped in endless illumination. The darkness, which once invited rest, has been colonized by screens. And yet, beneath the glow of our devices, the same unease lingers, that sense that something is wrong, that the light we trust might not be truth at all, but illusion. The echo of Edison's empire vibrates through every glowing rectangle, every city skyline, every sleepless night lit by blue light. The promise of illumination has become the reality of exposure. We are more visible than ever, and less free. We have endless light, and yet, the world has never felt darker. Perhaps the true invention of the light bulb was not illumination, but blindness, the human capacity to mistake brilliance for wisdom, brightness for goodness, and progress for truth. Because the echo that began in Menlo Park has not faded. It has multiplied. History has a strange way of coming full circle, not as justice, but as haunting. The men who reached for the light were betrayed by those who turned it into profit. And now, centuries later, we find ourselves in the same position, dazzled by invention, blind to its cost. The light bulb story was never just about technology. It was a mirror, and we are still staring into it, unable to look away from our own reflection. Because what began as a battle for patents has become a war for truth itself. Our modern world, luminous, hyper-connected, always on, thrives on the same illusion that birthed Edison's myth, that progress justifies everything. That the ends excuse the means. That human consequence is merely collateral damage on the road to innovation. But deep down, we know this is false. Behind every leap forward lies a shadow, workers unseen, environments consumed, lives quietly sacrificed to keep the current flowing. For every glowing success story, there are countless others extinguished, unacknowledged, and unrecorded. The light bulb was only the first domino in a chain reaction that would define the century to come. Edison's triumph taught the world a dangerous lesson, that ownership is genius, and narrative is truth. From that seed grew a forest of illusions, corporations built on borrowed ideas, empires forged through erasure. We learned not to ask who really created, but who controls the story. And so, the same blindness repeats itself. We marvel at new technologies, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, clean energy, yet rarely question their architects. We forget the forgotten, as easily as those before us forgot Swann, Goebel, and Lodygen. We celebrate the light, and ignore the burn. But history whispers still, through every bulb that hums above us, every pixel that glows before our eyes. It asks a single, terrifying question, one we can no longer afford to ignore. Does progress justify the price of truth? If every generation must choose between innovation and integrity, what remains of us when the scales finally break? If every bright idea demands a sacrifice, how long before there is nothing left to give? The reckoning is not coming. It has already arrived, quietly, invisibly, through the devices we hold, the grids we depend on, the lies we accept because they glow too beautifully to question. The light that promised freedom has bound us in its radiance. We no longer live by light. We live under it. And perhaps that is the true curse of Edison's invention, not that it conquered the dark, but that it made us fear it forever. Because to face the darkness again, would mean facing ourselves. The story of the light bulb is the story of us. A tale of yearning and blindness, of brilliance and betrayal. It began with a spark, the oldest human instinct, to push back the night, to understand the unknown, to make creation obey the mind. But somewhere along that luminous path, wonder was replaced by ownership. Discovery became dominion. And light, once sacred, was shackled to profit. Edison did not invent light. He merely proved how easily humanity would trade truth for radiance. He turned the divine act of illumination into an empire, and in doing so, taught us how to deceive ourselves. We call him a genius because he changed the world. But genius, when stripped of conscience, is only another form of power. The forgotten inventors, Davy, Swann, Lodygen, De La Rue, Goebel, were not saints, yet they represent something that progress has nearly extinguished, the purity of pursuit. They sought light not to rule it, but to share it. Their names are footnotes, their faces erased, their dreams absorbed into a single, convenient myth. But perhaps their tragedy holds the lesson we still need to learn, that truth, like light, cannot be owned. It can only be tended. When we look back at the incandescent glow, at the birth of the modern world, we are not witnessing the dawn of enlightenment, but the moment we began mistaking illumination for understanding. The brighter our inventions became, the darker their consequences grew. We lit the earth, but dimmed the soul. And now, in a world drenched in light, cities that never sleep, screens that never fade, we have nowhere left to hide from our own reflection. The darkness we once feared has moved inward, into conscience, into silence. Because to truly see the light, one must first accept the shadow that shapes it. Every beam contains its darkness. Every discovery carries its loss. Every myth conceals a wound. Edison's light still burns, yes, in every home, every street, every sleepless night of our restless civilization. But it burns not as a triumph, rather as a reminder. A candle to the forgotten, an epitaph to the unacknowledged, a monument to the beautiful cruelty of human ambition. And if there is one truth that remains after all the stories, all the myths, all the centuries of glow, it is this. The light we worship was never innocent. It did not banish the dark. It only taught it how to hide.